Hey, human beings! Hi, everyone, and welcome to this brand new episode of the GattoCast Live. Tonight, I'm going to talk again about lockdowns and restrictions and why they are not a good idea. And I think I did a very long and boring episode the first time, but I really feel the need to do it again because this idea is really hard to how would you say, it's still floating around, and there's still plenty of people considering this a good idea. And I would argue that there's plenty of evidence that indeed it's not, and there's we should really give up on thinking that these kind of restrictions are helpful in containing the pandemic. But let me start again from the beginning. So, mainly within science, which is exactly what the guys that the people that usually are in favor of these measures also say that they're using to propose this. They say that they're these kind of restrictions are based on data and science. But if you dig if you dig enough into the data, into the mechanisms behind them, then you would see, I guess, that it's pretty clear that there's no data and there's no science behind this kind of reasoning. So behind the choice of fully locked down countries, which means preventing people from going out, from shutting the stores, closing bars and restaurants, and so on and so forth. There's absolutely no case for that once you look at the data. I will be mainly discussing a very good article that makes a very good summary on the issue and takes into account most of the data that we have on the subject. So, okay, sorry, they say the sound is saturating. Can you hear me now? Is it right? Sorry. Okay. So please let me know if you can hear me well. But anyway, let me start again with the whole idea. And so, why is it that we are still dealing with lockdowns, and why is it that we are still is this a popular idea? I mean, everyone knows that it's very painful to close people in their homes and prevent them from going out and shutting down restaurants and so on and so on and so forth. But the whole point is that the theory behind it is pretty much logical. So it makes sense, and it sounds to be scientific just because it makes sense. So it's the idea is that there's this virus going around, and we are bringing it around. So while we breathe, we breathe into the air aerosols and droplets with very small drops of water or whatever it is, saliva into the air. And so these things carry around the virus. So when we move, and if we are infected with the virus and we move and we breathe, then we bring the virus with us. And so if you go to places where you see other people, like restaurants or bars or anything else that you might come to your mind, then you would think that gathering people together would help the transmission. And I mean, there's no point arguing about it. I think it's pretty logical, right? But again, this rests on many assumptions if you think about it, because it's you're assuming that everyone is equally likely to get the virus. I mean, if you get one particle of virus, so to say, you're equally likely of developing the infection as everyone else. Or, for example, you're still assuming that the virus, for example, even when you leave, then it's not there anymore. Maybe staying there for hours, so it's it doesn't matter if you stayed in a place for 5 minutes or 2 hours. I mean, we don't know that exactly. And I know there are studies on that, but I would question that. I don't think we know exactly what's the mechanics of transmission, and this is based on another kind of observation. So first let me again stress something that is should be the core of science, of the scientific method, which is not what the scientists say. I mean, because most of the times here, when we debate this argument, we hear people saying, "Oh, but the experts said this, and so we should trust the experts." I think we should trust the experts on many cases, but first of all, this is a new thing, and so maybe, you know, maybe everyone is wrong, or most of the people are wrong, or many people are wrong. The experts might be wrong as well. It happened tens of times in the past, so this might be the case as well. Um, but again, you need to trust the data. You need to trust the scientific method. And so what the scientific method tells you is that if you have a theory, and your theory says that B and C cause D, right? So you have some kind of effect, say you have some cause and effect, right? So you have a virus, and then you say that if you do A, that is lockdowns, then you don't have D, which is the effect, right? So the fact that you get infections in this case, then you would say in this, within this framework, you would argue that you should, I mean, this is what you should argue, is that if you remove this, or if you remove the contact between people, then you shouldn't see infections anymore, right? Or the other way around. I mean, if you still keep, if you don't prevent people from interacting, from meeting, then you should see a lot of that effect, because you are saying that it's a people meeting, in this case, that is mediating the transmission of the virus. And yet that's the main channel. Okay, so everything is driven by that. That's why we are focusing so much efforts, as I mean, I'm talking about we, but you know, our governments, on preventing people from meeting, on preventing, you know, people from gathering in pubs and restaurants, everywhere. We are this is what's happening right now in Italy. So we entered a sort of soft lockdown. So in many regions, basically everywhere, restaurants are closed except for one region. And there's a curfew, so you cannot go out of home after 8 in most of the country. And there's lots of other restrictions. So again, this is the kind of measures that are implemented in order to prevent people from meeting. And so as a response, as an effect of these measures, what you would see is a drastic, you know, if let's say you have two countries, one is doing this and the other is not doing that. If you don't do that, if you say that, if your theory says that, you know, it's interactions between people that drive the curse of the pandemic, then if you don't prevent people from interacting, if you don't prevent people from meeting, then you should see something which is very different from the other case. And again, I don't think it's, you know, like closing all the restaurants in one city, closing all the bars, preventing people from going to museums and cinemas. That's like, I think you're reducing, you know, the kinds of interactions and gatherings, like by a lot. I don't know the numbers, but I would say that you have hundreds of thousands of people less in meeting every night, right? And so this, if you are preventing hundreds of thousands of people from meeting, like millions of people probably, from meeting in bars, in restaurants, in pubs, in you know, in schools, everywhere, and you are just, you know, you have these stay-at-home orders, then you should see an effect. Definitely, it should be completely different from what happens in places where these millions of interactions are taking place. And it's not just that you cannot just argue, you cannot explain it away by saying, oh, but you know, the places where these interactions are taking place, they have, you know, they are washing their hands, they're putting masks on, or they are keeping distance, because this is exactly the same thing that we have been doing in most of Europe so far, most of lockdown Europe. And so I really think that, again, this is the kind of way you should argue about the thing, that we have this virus that is spreading, we don't really know the dynamics. The theory says that if you block everyone, if you prevent everyone from meeting, then you shouldn't see an effect anymore. You should reduce the contagions, you should reduce the spread of the virus, which means you should reduce the number of deaths, for example. But this is not something that we see in the data. And so what should we do here? Scientifically, the idea has always been the same, if you find some data that is contradicting your theory, then you need to think hard about the new theory. Data is king. And it's not enough to say that my theory predicts that after 1 week, for example, after the lockdown, then the peak of the curve will be reduced, will be going down, right? Will be reached after 1 week, probably 1 week, 2 weeks, and then after that, the number of cases will be reduced. It's not enough, because science works by falsification. So that's Popper's theory, in the sense that you can always find out a theory it can be verified. For example, I might say that the reduction in the number of cases is not driven by interventions of the government. It's driven by prayers. And I might say, look, in Italy, every time we enter into the red zone, we enact the lockdowns, I'm starting to pray God, and then after 2 weeks, God is making the curve go down. And you see, that's also my prayer theory, or any other theory you could make, would have exactly the same kind of compliance with the data, because I can always say, oh, but I'm praying God, and then God made the cases go down after a while. Well, it's a theory, but let's test it against the data. The thing is that you should say, okay, you should say like this: is if I'm praying and then nothing happens, like it's not happening for example, sorry, it's the other way around. If I'm not praying, then I should see an exponential rise of the cases. And then if it doesn't happen, it means that probably praying is not an important factor at all. Same thing with the lockdowns. So what I want to talk about here then is exactly this: is the fact that I think we really have forgotten the importance of the data and falsification, especially. So especially looking at the cases that do not fit our theory, because so far people all around Europe have been focusing themselves, all their efforts, on confirming their theories. So you have a theory of how the virus spreads, and you predict that if you intervene in that way, then the virus doesn't spread anymore. You see that at some point, we don't know exactly when, because in some cases it might be 1 month, some cases 2 weeks, some cases it's 1 week. If you look at at all the curves in each country, it's always more or less random when the time frame that passes between the start of the lockdown and the reaching of the peak of the curve. But nonetheless, you have this theory, and so first of all, you don't really know what's the time frame. But the actual thing that you should look at, again, is those places that didn't do the same thing. What happened to them? Because all of these interventions they started with an underlying hypothesis. And the hypothesis was that if we don't do anything, cases will grow exponentially until we don't reach herd immunity. So until there's enough people that are being infected by the virus, that the virus won't have anyone anymore to infect. So there will be recovered people from the virus, there will be dead people, and there will be infected people. At some point, you will have just enough people that have already been infected, that are either still infected or either dead or recovered. And so at some point you won't have anyone to infect anymore, and that's the point where the virus is going to stop its spread. And this was the reason why we needed to stop. We had this whole flattening of the curve. We needed to prevent people from getting infected very quickly. So if the exponential process is true, then it means that many people will get infected very quickly, and eventually they will saturate the intensive care units. Unless we prevent people from meeting, unless we shut down everything, and this way, it was argued, we should cut the chain of contagion. But was this the case? I mean, let me introduce you to this article that I already posted on my page a couple of times, I guess, but and I think it's really worth reading it. There's a lot of technical data, but it's a very good summary of what are the ideas behind this, and why Again, this is scientific. There's no conspiracy theory here. There's no, it's based on data and science and evidence. And I think it's something that should be kept in mind. And again, the idea is that you should start from the data and then use the data as a benchmark to judge how good your theory is. It's not the other way around. We shouldn't massage or elaborate the data so much in order to make them fit our prejudice, because this is what's happening at the moment. So, well, it starts with a very nice plot here. It's the cumulative number of deaths per million. So this is the number of how many people died per million. There's two curves. This is the European Union versus Sweden. And so you have the curve here. It's the azure curve that is, you can see that they are pretty much equal one to the other. And this is with time. So this is the cumulative. So it's the total number of deaths normalized by million of inhabitants. All right, so the article starts with this very important sentence, which I would agree with, and it says that a year ago, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit most of the world, there was arguably a good case for lockdowns. The initial growth of the epidemic implied a high basic reproduction number, which in turn meant that unless transmission was reduced, the virus would quickly sweep throughout most of the population, because incidence would continue to grow exponentially until herd immunity threshold. And this was what I was telling you before. So here we're dealing with a theory. Again, it's the epidemiologic theory that tells you that, if you have this kind of exponential growth, this is the key sentence, then the virus would quickly sweep through most of the population and grow exponentially until the herd immunity threshold was reached. So it would just grow regardless of any other parameter until you reach herd immunity, unless you cut this chain of transmission, right? And so this is what many people still think nowadays. So many people continue to reason along those lines. All right, but since then we have learned that whatever the precise effect of the that lockdowns and other stringent restrictions have, it is not so large that it can easily be picked up by the data, as it would surely be if restriction had the very large effect that pro-lockdown advocates claim. This means that it's very hard to see any effect of the lockdowns in the data. So the first thing is that many factors likely contribute. Now it's going there. I don't want to dig too much into what are the possible effects, but first of all, people just modify their behavior regardless of what the law is telling them to do, and so maybe it's just enough to change a little bit of our behavior to prevent the transmission. You don't need to shut down everything to reduce transmission. Just the fact that people know that there is a virus going around might be, and then when they know that there's a virus going around, they might be, less likely to go out and go to concerts and all these kind of events. Maybe that's enough. Maybe, I'm saying maybe, I don't know. This is something I would know for sure. So there's some explanations here on the reason why lockdowns might be very effective, but so the thing is that okay, let me just just move forward. So even if you make a completely implausible assumption about the effect of restrictions of transmission and ignore all of their costs except their immediate effect on other people's well-being, they do not pass a cost-benefit test. Again, even if you assume that they are working, this is something that it's done at the end of the article. I don't really subscribe to what's being done there, but he admits that it's not very precise, but it's just giving a rough idea. Because I'm not talking about cost benefits. I'm not talking about the cost of the lockdown, and neither is he for most of this article. Because the whole idea is here to analyze the impact that lockdowns had on data, whether you can see something. And the fact is, that most of this debate is focused on Sweden, but there's lots of other countries and places that didn't really lock down at least during the second wave, or they didn't implement the same kind of harsh restrictions that were implemented in most of Europe during the first wave, for sure, and the second wave also. For example, in Germany, where all schools, any kind of school, was shut down, and you had, I think it was at least 2 months of complete lockdown. So the thing is that there's, of course, there's other places that didn't do that. And again, if you believe in the theory that exponential contagion takes place, you should see thousands more people dead in those places. It should be you shouldn't even be able to compare that, because again, we are not talking about something small here. We're talking about locking down an entire country. You cannot just say that if some people go out despite the lockdown, then that's what's still driving the infections, because 99% of the restaurants are still closed. 99% of the bars are still closed. Maybe I don't know what's the non-compliance rate. It's very low for sure in Italy. And so there's still, millions of people that are prevented from meeting in every country every night. So you multiply, how much did you reduce the interaction? It's a lot. It's a lot. You're preventing people from meeting in bars and cinemas. And you cannot just explain that away by saying that in some places, for example, Japan, they kept everything opened. For example, Florida, North Dakota, Alabama, there's a bunch of American states, US states, that were kept open. And so, again, the bottom line here is that you should judge the policies by their effects. The main thing here is not whether, I still think it's true that you can get COVID by interaction with some people. Of course you do. But is it the main driver? I don't know. Judging from the data, I would say that we really need to change our understanding, because if you still see lots of infections taking place in places where they were completely shut down, then it means that you have at least other channels of interactions that you're not taking into account at the moment. All right, so let me go back to the article, and this was something I already said. So back in spring, I was in favor of lockdowns, but since then I have reached the conclusion that the lockdowns and other stringent restrictions do not make sense from a cost-benefit perspective. And it's not even the point from, what we're saying right now is that he further changed his mind. So, however, in this post, I will not be arguing for this view. I only want to argue that regardless of what would have been done last spring, the data we have accumulated since then shows very clearly that whatever the precise effect of lockdowns and other stringent restrictions, it is not nearly as large as we might have thought. So again, the idea here, the point here is not even arguing about cost-benefit analysis, because this is also something legitimate that you should do. If, to prevent 10,000 people dying from COVID, you kill 100,000 in the process, well, then it means that this measure is not worth taking. But even regardless, because here, what we are arguing is that we don't even know even without knowing the cost of the lockdowns per se have an effect that is very, very, very hard to disentangle in the data. All right, so again, back to Sweden. I've shown this plot already. The point is, the main point that he's making, and the same point that I agree, is that policy is not the only factor affecting the epidemic, and that's the point. And so this graph does not show that lockdowns and other stringent restrictions have no effect. But if policy mattered as much as pro-lockdowns advocates claim, it would look completely different. If you say that lockdowns are essential to stop the spread of the pandemic, these two lines should be completely different. And this is one thing. If you say that lockdowns are one among the hundreds of factors that affect the course of the pandemic, which I'm not denying that lockdowns might have some effect. On like they might prevent some cases from happening. Maybe, yeah, it's true. The point is that when you aggregate a full data set, when you look at things on a whole, you don't find anything. Um, you don't find anything of this effect. You should see two completely different lines. You should see that places, like basically the whole EU went to some phase of lockdown. Sweden didn't, most remarkably. And so then you should really see two completely different curves. Because in one place, you are still allowing people to go to the gym, you're still allowing people to go to school, to go to, they did that in the EU as well, admittedly, but, like we had several lockdowns in Italy. Now as I said, we entered a second one. We had a lot of restrictions. We had, gyms closed and some schools were closed, universities closed. This was not the case in Sweden. So if again, you're allowing millions of people more every night, you're allowing them to meet. So indeed, although Sweden has tightened restrictions to fight the epidemic in recent months, and the other EU countries have, on the contrary, used less stringent restrictions in Sweden remain much less stringent than almost everywhere else in Europe. And this is true again. If you say that measures count that much, then you should see a remarkable difference. And again, if you there were exactly these predictions being made back in April, and they were based on this epidemiologic models where they were showing that if you took them seriously, so these mathematical models of the spread of the epidemic predicted at least 96,000 dead in Sweden by June 2020, and they were, I think, around 4,000 at that time. So it was a factor around 25 difference between the predictions and what happened. The thing is then, why didn't people change their mindset? Why do we still think about that? Again, the reason is that I guess that people are sort of, the experts, and it's not all the experts, because many of the experts actually do not think it's the right way to go. But those that are usually given voice by the government, these experts usually tend to still think that their models are right, and if the model doesn't work, then it's not a problem with the model. It's that people are not complying enough, or they didn't lock down hard enough. So these are the two usual explanations. They say if we only lock down like China, and then this is just to open a parenthesis. It's funny because people say we should do like China, but when you say we should do like Sweden, no, we cannot do like Sweden because we are completely different than Sweden. Sorry, we are like in the same political union. I would say that Italy is probably closer to Sweden than it is to China. So if we have to implement any kind of measure, we should take the example from Sweden, not from China, which is a completely different country by orders of magnitude from Italy, as far as I would tell. And again, so this is the another graph that's showing the cumulative number of COVID deaths per million in the EU. This is the full European Union, I guess. And you see that all these lines have more or less a similar pattern. You have this flattened thing during the summer, and then they start again in October. I mean, this is something also very interesting. If you see, they all start to rise around October, right? It's the first to third week of October, they all start to rise again. And this is, I mean, for me, it's interesting, and I would say this is the thing that made me think seriously about the lockdowns, because we have been told since the beginning of the epidemics that climate didn't matter that much. It was not seasonal. It was a virus that would be floating around no matter what, and so we really needed to be careful. And then all of a sudden, when the fall kicks in, all of the countries start to rise again, and with different rates, granted, with different rates, different death per millions. But again, you have 30 different countries with different policies, different everything, and they you get the same kind of wave at the same point. Maybe there's some external factor that's driving this start of this other wave. Maybe this is not something I was discussed so much. At least not as much. Wasn't probably given so the relevance it should have been given. Anyway, so this is another interesting plot, and this is the point that he's making is that although there remain significant disparities between EU countries, what is striking, if you have kept yourself informed about various policies used to contain the epidemic in various EU countries, is the lack of any clear relationship between policy and outcomes. So this is something that has been analyzed as a number of studies have been studying the relationship between the stringency of the lockdowns and the death rates in a country. And they never were able to find anything. You can correlate this with mask wearing mandates and the kind of laws that were enacted in different countries. But again, you see these numbers. Can you see some trend between deaths and, you know, like Belgium, for example, had the most stringent policies, were shut down for ages. They are still shut down as far as I know. Czech Republic performed, like, did pretty well during the first lockdown. Second lockdown, it was huge death rate. There's basically, you know, there's and Czech Republic, by the way, also did a very stringent lockdown as far as I know. So you really don't see there's no pattern here. And again, if you are saying that, you know, it's not like you're doing something small here. You're shutting down an entire economy, an entire country. You're preventing people from traveling, right? So if you do this, you should really see a lot of effect. It's not something small. It's not that you know we changed the speed limit by 5 kilometers per second, or we changed the shutting down of the bus from 11 to 10. You're preventing the bars from functioning. You're preventing the restaurants from functioning. There's lots of places that are not working. So why is it the case that you don't see such a strong effect in the data? And again, this is mind-boggling. I mean, again, you can probably dig enough into the data and do some kind of more sophisticated analysis, and, you know, take other factors into account. And I'm sure, you know, between the lockdowns and other policies, there are other factors. But again, this is just telling you that policy alone is not so important. So it's one of these many factors, and say that maybe, you know, if the epidemics depends on a number like 10, 20 variables, then each one of them should have a relative weight, a relative contribution to the spread of the epidemic. And in this case, I would say that, you know, the again, judging from the data, given that, you know, you have a very strong there were very strong interventions being made, you simply don't see the dominance of these interventions over other factors, which means that the interventions per se were subdominant with respect to other factors. At least, like which means in a way it's like saying they were not so relevant. Maybe they had some weight. Maybe, I mean, granted, but surely it's not like as striking as it should be, because if closing down restaurants, if closing down gyms and schools is something essential to stop the spread of the pandemic, then you should see huge differences between the places that did shut down schools and bars and those who didn't, like Sweden. Then why is this not the case? Again, it cannot just be because some places shake hands and some other not, because if anything, I would argue that Germans are at least at every bit as compliant as the Swedes to the rules, and they're also not so warm, so they don't hug each other, they don't kiss each other as much as we do, for example, in Italy or in other South European countries. And so you should still explain why you had with two very different policies regarding shutdowns and lockdowns, you still had a very similar outcome. So it cannot be behavior, because behavior was the same, policy was very different. And so if policy mattered that much, then you should see a completely different result. But it doesn't. Again, and so this is something striking, and it really makes me upset, is that every time you see in the media people talking about lockdowns, people talking about places that were kept open, they were always treated like okay, so before I enter this What did Finland do? It has the lowest there, but they are known for not being very social. So it's true Finns are not very social, but they didn't shut down very harshly on the second wave. During, I think, until December, they were more opened than Sweden on many things. Then I remember they shut down gyms and other facilities in Helsinki at least. Now I don't know. They might have as well locked down, but they never had a huge diffusion of the pandemic. So maybe it's behavior, but it cannot be just behavior, because there's many places that were not so social and they still had very large numbers. And still, again, even if you're not social, if you're still going to school, you're going to bars, you're going to restaurants, you're going to the gym, it's not just the fact that you're not being social, because in one place you're staying home alone for every week for a few months and you're not meeting anyone. In the other place, even if you're not social, you're still crossing paths with thousands of people every day, because you're still going to the restaurants, bars, gyms. So anyway, so this is the thing that's it's pretty upsetting, and it's disturbing, I would say. That again, so this is what they're saying. It's the fact that once you see some place opening, for example, or some place that is allowing concerts, you always see the headlines. Oh, this place is going to be doomed and it's going to be destroyed, and if they open this now, everyone will die. There's going to be really I'm not making this up. So look at, for example, back in April, The Atlantic published a piece called "Georgia's Experiment in Human Sacrifice," decrying the decision by the governor of that state to lift many restrictions. Okay, so let's have a look at the result of this so-called experiment. And you see that the average of the US and Georgia is exactly the same. So it didn't do worse than the rest of the country by opening everything in April. So did anyone, acknowledge this fact? So again, you have a theory that's telling that if you open everything, everyone will die. Then it doesn't happen. You should at least say, okay, maybe my theory, my assumptions were wrong. And this has been done over and over again. This is something that's happening all the time. When Japan said they would open, again, there were headlines saying that Japan is going, to certain death, and same thing for Florida, same thing for, I don't know, there's just so many places that opened, and then they were decried. The whole Southeast Asia, basically. Anyway, so this is, I'll just keep this. And again, what's remarkable in the US is that you had 50 different policies. Basically, every state was having its own policy. And again, if you look at the graph, the same graph I was showing before for the European Union, is that if you look at number of deaths per million versus the state, you don't really see a clear connection with the kind of policy that was enacted, right? It's not there. I mean, you cannot just argue that those with low numbers had the most stringent lockdowns, and those with high death rates had no lockdown, because that's simply not what's happening. And again, this is something that should be remarked, and I really like this sentence, because even if someone has been able to find a large effect of non-pharmaceutical interventions on transmission with a more sophisticated statistical analysis, the fact that it doesn't jump at you when you look at this kind of simple graphs should make you skeptical of that finding. And the larger the effect, the more skeptical you should be. Because if non-pharmaceutical interventions really had a very large effect, it should be easy to see without fancy statistics. Again, this is non-pharmaceutical interventions, that is lockdowns, restrictions, and so on and so forth. They are the elephant in the room. It's something huge that they are doing to the population. You're doing something huge, and you don't see any huge effect. You don't see almost any effect. There's, again, maybe if you do some kind of fancy correlation stuff, you can sort of try to single out some kind of correlation. between those two variables, between non-pharmaceutical intervention and reduction in death rates. But the fact that you don't see it, because it's not like, oh, it's one among the many factors. Well, then if it's just one among the many factors, why are we paying such a high price for this? Because we are, I mean, again, I didn't mention that we, as I'm talking about myself as a musician, but about all the people that I know that work in the industry. And it's something that, by the way, it's really upsetting that no one in the industry, on the music industry, is doing anything about this, in the sense no one is protesting. They are just shutting down all the events, and no one is even trying to argue that, you know, maybe closing everything is not the solution. And, you know, just because places that did not close everything didn't undergo that kind of exponential, indefinite exponential explosion of the cases. So maybe we can find a way to reopen at least some things and do things in a certain way, as, you know, because we know that things do not work that way. I mean, that theory of, you know, that the virus will circulate until you reach herd immunity and it will circulate in an exponential fashion is false. That's been falsified by the data. So there's other factors at play, for sure. And we need to focus on what these other factors are, and it's not just government interventions. All right, so there's a last point. Well, there's many other points. And this is also very interesting, because if you look closely enough to these curves, then you can find that you will find that in most of the cases, the lockdowns were enacted when the peak of the curve was already reached. So it's very hard to argue that, you know, if you have a curve that's going up and then you know, that's you have the data, you have the the curve is going up, you reach the peak, and then the peak starts to go down, and it starts going down maybe 2 or 3 days before the lockdown. So how can you argue that something you did 3 days after that is bringing the curve down, if the curve was already going down before that? You might say maybe the lockdown has some effect on, like, accelerating the decrease of the curve. It might be. Again, in some cases you can see that the peak of the curve was reached much later than the lockdown. The point is that in general there is no pattern between the date of the closure and the decrease of the curve. So again, this is for example, this is a plot about France. Let me go to this one. Okay, so daily number of COVID cases in Paris during the second wave. And so you had, this is the first curfew, and then you see you reached the peak, and then after a few days you had the national lockdown. So you might still argue that the curfew had some kind of effect here in reaching the peak, maybe the lockdown, but surely you cannot argue that the lockdown was necessary at this point, because it was already going down. You might say, look, it's going down faster because of the lockdown. Maybe. You cannot say that cases started to decrease thanks to the lockdown. That's something you cannot say for sure. But again, this is just one curve, and it's one country. The thing they should do is gather evidence on many other places and try to see if there is some kind of consistent pattern between shutting down and reaching the peak. Anyway, so this is another interesting case. Let me just skim through this data. Okay, well, I was talking about the UK before going to the UK. Okay, so this is something interesting because it's something I posted already. But again, let me go through this plots again, because something that people have said is that you should lock down very early in order to spread in order to stop the spread of the pandemic. And so one of these places is Peru. Okay. Again, pro-lockdown advocates like to insist that lockdowns are most effective when they are done early and the rules are stringent. And so Peru did exactly this. They had 9 nationwide registered cases, no death from COVID. The curve was very, very flat at the beginning. They sent the army in the streets, So again, you can argue that maybe not everywhere in Peru they had um, the control of the army. On the other hand, I don't think in rural villages on the Andes they had some kind of control. But I would argue that if you go to cities and you had the army there, that's also where you would register the cases. Like probably they would not register. I mean, if you didn't have the army, you don't have the hospital. Like you don't have the states, right? If you argue that much of the country is probably not really under control of the state, which might be true to some degree, um, then it means that you're not even checking for the numbers in those places because you don't have hospitals. And so these numbers, you can still have a lot of errors and uncertainties. But something that we know for sure is that Peru had the worst excess mortality in 2020 and had one of the most stringent lockdowns. In fact, if you look at Oxford Stringency Index, it had like 80 on the stringency of the lockdown, which was like from 0 to 100 scale, and it was one of the highest. It's like the highest after China during the first 2 months in Wuhan. And so again, but this is the point. I mean, you're doing something so stringent. You're sending the army in the streets. Entire cities are prevented from from leaving because they had a 3 p.m. curfew. Same thing, by the way, they had in Panama something very similar where only male or female could go out, men or women could go out during the day. So they had days where men were allowed to go out and other days where women were allowed to go out. And again, this is not what you would expect. I mean, you wouldn't expect the highest mortality. You would expect some, maybe. You would say, well, maybe the rules were not so tightly enforced everywhere, and maybe there was some corruption and people were still going around. But if you have the army in the streets and you close everything at 3 p.m., it's a very, very strong measure. You shouldn't see any. You should it's not like no one should die, but if these cases are recorded in places where you have the army, then it means where you have hospitals and the state presence, state officials recording the cases, it means you had the army as well enforcing the lockdowns. So I don't really trust the fact that you cannot just say that people were doing whatever they wanted because no one was checking. No, they were, and those that were checked, all these numbers come exactly from those areas that were being checked by the army. So it's very hard to make a case for that. And this is exactly the opposite. So again, this is the opposite of what the theory says. What should we do with this? We're still hanging to this theory. Why are we still doing that? Of course, because the theory makes sense. Again, it's logic. I'm not saying it's not. It's like something it's metaphysics. It has some grounds and in some plausible grounds, but it's not what's happening in reality. So should we take the theory or should we take reality? Again, this was what I was mentioning before. And this is another of the graphs that's being used by the lockdowners to show that lockdowns work. And this after a week, you see you reach the peak just a week after the lockdown. Except this is the daily number of recorded cases, but the date of report, which means the day that were reported to the authorities, which is not the day in which they were recorded, because not all of the hospitals and health institutions report daily to the ministry, or sometimes the update is not. I'm not sure about the mechanism, but that's the difference between the day the case was recorded and the day it was reported and given to the authorities. Because if you normalize by this, so there's a way that you can again I don't know the exact thing, but this is the date of specimen. So this is the date where the cases were actually being recorded, right? And so this is the number, and you see that the peak was reached before the lockdown. This is the peak. The lockdown is maybe 1 or 2 days later, and then the curve is going down. And again, it's very hard to argue that it started going down thanks to the lockdown. You might say somehow that it went down faster. Same thing here. This is England divided by again, this is by date of specimen, so it's like the Again, it's the same number, so it's by the day in which it was recorded, not reported. And this is, again, this is the if you normalize this, like you sorry, not normalize, but you know, if you, again, you adjust by the actual date, then you see that all these numbers, all the peaks happen before the national lockdown was enacted, right? So, and it's still there. And yeah, so in Spain they didn't report shit during weekends. Same thing. That's why you see very often there are fluctuations in the data. That's what you see most of the time if you don't do this 7-day moving average, which means you do some kind of average to smooth out these gaps in reporting. Then you would see huge fluctuations about the data. That's what you see every time. So again, that's what that's what you need to adjust for, not just by you know, doing a moving average, but you need to shift some of the data back and try to trace them back to the reported date. Now there's a lot more of graphs here, and I'm not digging into this again. So this is, now we are entering the third wave. I don't know if you noticed, but pretty much everywhere in Europe we are facing this kind of, you know, rising third wave of COVID infections. It's in Italy, for example. This is something that was striking me all the time, because they were claiming in Italy, if only we had lockdown like in Germany, we would have prevented the third wave from happening. Except it's taking place in Germany as well. Granted, it might be smaller. I mean, it would most likely be a smaller third wave than the second one, but it's taking place nonetheless, despite how many months of lockdown? Maybe 2 or something. So 3 months at least. So again, this mentioning Serbia, it's another place that had no lockdown. They had some curfews, they had some shutdowns of the restaurants and bars pretty much early during the day. Not, I think around 9 or 10 was until December, January. I don't know the details, I'm sorry, but they never really locked down. Maybe during the first wave they had a very early policijski čas, so you had these curfews taking place at 5, but they never really did shut down everything. Like, many shops were still being open during the first wave. Second wave was still more opened, and again you see it's the same pattern. So they had the peak around December, early December, and then it's going down, no lockdown again, and now there's a third wave. It's like in Sweden. So same thing in Florida. You can look at Florida. It's one of the most interesting cases, because Florida is completely opened. I don't know if you remember the like metalheads might remember that there were a lot of noise on social media in December, because Steel Panther dared to play some shows, and there were, I guess, at least thousands of people in indoor clubs packed with thousands of people in Florida. Everyone was predicting doom. Florida had I think the Super Bowl. I don't know the details because I don't know anything about the Super Bowl. I know there were at least hundreds of thousands of people without masks celebrating in the streets. Everyone was predicting doom and gloom, and nothing of that happened. Again, I'm not advocating for going to clubs with thousands of people or doing celebrations, but on the other hand, if you do, you know, you let people meet and do this kind of celebrations, and the data, it's not that nothing is happening. There are still cases, but again, it's descending like everywhere else. Then you should explain me why. Why, if you say that these events are so important and they drive so much the curve and they have so much relevance, then why don't you see this in the data? What's going on there? I mean, maybe it's something that can just happen in Florida because of the climate, or because of the population age, or because Cubans have some kind of natural immunity. I don't know. Just a note, so Florida is going quite fast with the vaccination. Yes, but this was in December, before the vaccine, before everything. So December there were the shows, and it went down before that. So I think vaccination might help explaining why they won't face a third curve of infections, or at least of deaths. So again, this is the daily number of COVID deaths. You always see there is some delay between the infection curve and the death curve, but this is not relevant. And so anyway, this is going again, and people are, they're saying Swedish disaster, Georgia experiment in human sacrifice. There's plenty of articles on Florida as well. Everyone was predicting disasters, but it's not happening. And again, this is another important point, that when you point out counterexamples to their view, pro-lockdown individuals always have a way to explain them away. So they are always ready to bring up difference between places that have not locked down and others that did not, which they believe explains why the epidemic wasn't significantly worse in the former than in the latter. In the case of Sweden, what always comes up is population density. For example, if Sweden did not have more COVID deaths than many countries, it's because they have a very low population density. The problem is that when you look at the data, there is no clear relationship between population density and the number of COVID-19 deaths per capita. Again, this, when people say, for example, okay, so this is a plot, this is the number of deaths, and this is the population density, population-weighted population density, and you don't see, there's a very, very weak correlation. It's really hard to make a case for P is 0.19, it's not statistically significant. R square 0.05, it's very, very hard to make a point to make a case for a positive correlation between number of deaths and density. So this means in practical terms that density is not an important factor driving the pandemic, at least again when you average between lots of countries. Just look at death rates and population density, and you don't see there's no correlation on large scales. By the way, there is Belarus here, and Belarus is also a very interesting example because though I'm no fan of Lukashenko, of course, and I'm no fan of dictatorships, they are living in a freer society at the moment than we are in Europe. I must admit that. They are opened and there's no corpses piling up in the streets. That was the prediction that we had during the first epidemic, that if we don't close everything, there will be hospitals full and of dead people. It's not happening there, so maybe they're just hiding it. But if the numbers were as high as the predictions, so there was orders of millions of people, because that was the first predictions were during March and April. So it would be really hard at least to hide hundreds of thousands of dead people. There should be pictures of that. There should be something all over social media. We would have seen that. There's no way you can hide so many deaths in Europe. Like even by satellite you should see like piling up of dead bodies. Why is that not happening? Though the place is open, restaurants are open, there's concert, there's people going to dance halls, discotheques, and again, this is not to say that we should all go to discos and stuff, but if you are pro-lockdown, then you should explain to me then why this place, like many others, if you have a model that explain exactly why just Belarus and Florida are not being devastated completely by dead people, why are they not being like filled with corpses? So you should have a mathematical model that accounts for the fact that Belarus is it's going fine, but the same model should also account for the fact that if we didn't lock down in Italy for some factor, then we would all would have hundreds of thousands of dead people. This is what I'm expecting from a theory. Like you cannot just have a theory for one place and like assume it works everywhere. Like a theory, a mathematical model should be maybe you can change some parameters, of course, in order to apply it to a different situation, but the structure of the theory should be the same. If you have a mathematical theory, you need to have one structure with some parameters. You can adjust the parameters according to the case that you want to study, but the structure of the theory should be the same. And I want to see one theory that accounts for why is it Belarus not being filled with dead people? Why is it that, also, and that's, again, this is before the vaccines, before anything like the vaccines was introduced. Why is it that same thing didn't happen in Florida? Why is the same thing didn't happen in Sweden? And I want to see the same model applied. You can change some parameters, fine, okay, but I want to see this thing being applied to Sweden and Belarus, and tell me, look, they, for some kind of intrinsic property, they didn't need to lock down, but we need it. And then I want to understand, what is this intrinsic property? Why is it that if we Italians meet in a restaurant, we pass it to each other, even if we just sit on a table and we stay, we keep the distance, we don't hug anyone, because that's what we've been doing for the whole summer, at least for the fall, and until now when we would go to restaurants for lunchtime. We are not really hugging each other, there were few tables available. Again, so why is it that people in Belarus can do that and do not die, and why is it that we cannot do that? What's the element here that is making the difference? Because lockdowns, like, scientifically, I'm still open to the possibility that lockdowns might work under very special conditions. Why isn't anyone telling me what these special conditions are? Again, I would say that, judging by the data that I have so far, I wouldn't say that's the case, but still I'm open to that possibility. And I think it's something that is, should be discussed. If your theory is predicting something, then why isn't this something happening in some cases? So there's a lot more. This is Spain. Spain didn't really lock down during the second wave, and still it's going down. I know that in Madrid, bars were opened, for example, and you see the curve in Madrid, despite the bars being open even at night, I think until 10 or something. Okay. So anyway, so let me see if there is something more to this article. It's very long. I think I can end it here. I think it was already a very long episode of this GattoCast podcast. I hope it wasn't boring. I hope I could explain myself pretty clearly, at least. Again, I understand that making this point is not so popular nowadays. Many people that say that you shouldn't lock down, they're being seen as selfish. They think they want to open up everything just because they like going out and they don't care about other people's lives. But again, the point is not being selfish or not. It's like, this measure does not work. Like, you can see that there's, again, places that didn't lock down did not face this continuous wave of exponential growth of cases. None of them. There's the whole Southeast Asia, there's Belarus, there's Florida, there's Japan, there's Sweden. So this is, there's enough examples of places. There's a whole of Africa. Again, there's lots of places. There's places that completely shut down and still they were facing these waves of the pandemic. You can still see that in many cases the lockdowns were introduced after reaching the peak of the curve. So there's many reasons why you can make a case against the lockdown. It's pretty strong because, again, we are not talking about changing a law about, you have to go home by 2 or 3. It's a huge thing. So you have a huge thing, you have a huge impact on people's lives. You should see a huge effect, and you don't see that. Why? So, and again, it's very important. Now I hope we'll get over this with the vaccines, but my personal concern is that we've set a precedent for the future, which is very dangerous. It's something very dangerous. Now, how easy it was to close down entire society. Like, they could do it and there were basically no demonstrations, there were no protests. It was very It's very frightening because except for Serbia, as far as I know, no one really went in the streets to protest against shutdown against lockdowns, and it really showed how easy is it to have millions of people obey the government and say, okay, it's fine. I mean, granted, there's health issues, there are scientists, but if anything, I think this is something really bad for science, because again, science should start from the data, from the evidence, from the correlations that you see in the data, not from what you have in your mind. Even if it's a perfect theory, it works perfectly. Maybe you have even lab experiments. Maybe you have lab experiments on the on masks, on the way the virus is transmitted and everything. Then again, one thing is laboratory, the other thing is real life. So in real life, things do not really work like in the lab, right? So it's not everything under control. There's plenty of factors we are not controlling for. And so one thing again is that people usually say, oh, if only everyone just respected the rules, if only everyone just put on the mask, if only everyone, it's always like blaming it on someone that's not respecting the rules, which is, I mean, granted, there are people like that, but if you're still preventing 90% of the people from going to the bus because you're shutting down everything, so you cannot go to the bus. There might be some illegal parties somewhere, but this is like, if you think about this, like thousands of times smaller than what would happen in normal cases. So you're still saying that 1%, 2%, maybe 5% of the population that's not respecting the rules is responsible for the complete collapse of these rules, the complete malfunctioning of these rules. Then, I mean, if you have a theory that only works if 100% complies, then you shouldn't even dare to use that theory. I mean, you always need to have some margin, right? You cannot apply things that work only if 100% agrees. Then we're screwed. I mean, I don't think that's the case, but even if you would make that case that it only works, lockdowns only work if 100% of the people do that, even only if 90%, then we are screwed, because it will be very hard to get everyone on the same page. And though, I mean, and I think that the large majority, overwhelming majority of the people are obeying the mask mandates. They are not going to restaurants, they are not going to bars, there's no illegal bar. I haven't seen anyone. Maybe I heard of 2 in Rome out of I don't know how many thousands of restaurants and bars we have here. I know of 2 that they are open. I haven't been there. I heard about 2 places that might be open. So is that just because there are 2 places and maybe 100 people in a city of 3 millions that the virus is still going around? Come on, I think it's really preposterous. It's ridiculous thing. So, all right. So, let me know if you have more questions or other requests, or if you have some remarks. So, yeah, there were virus deniers, not lockdown deniers. So, again, this is another issue that people conflate the whole issues together. So one issue is the virus. I mean, the virus might be 100% mortality. I'm not denying there is a virus. I'm not even talking about the death rates. I mean, it might be the most dangerous virus ever. I'm just saying this measure, judged, by the data, it's not effective. Okay, because you have this thing, you have this cause, you have this effect. So you predict that if you do this, you should see this. You do this, you don't see that. Right? So it doesn't work. Granted, I mean, the prediction is if you don't lock down, you will have an exponential growth of cases, indefinite. No, it's not happening. It's not happening. You have enough cases to say that's not the case. It's not what's going on here. So we need to change the theory of how this virus propagates. And the other way around, again, it's like you say, if you shut down everyone and you prevent people from meeting, then the virus does not spread. No, there's counter examples to that as well. You see that in many cases the virus keeps spreading. So, and again, this has nothing to do with the virus. I mean, I'm not denying that the virus is there and it's dangerous, and I'm not denying that the vaccines work. I mean, I don't care about that. I'm not a doctor. I don't have training in biology or anything that's related to medicine. but I'm just judging. This is a theory, and these are the data. So this is something that I know very well how to do. How to estimate the likelihood that the theory is true given a set of observations. So we have observations and we have a theory. Is the theory in agreement with the observations? My answer is most likely no. You really need to change the theory from within and make the theory in agreement with the world view, with the world data. It's not the other way around. You shouldn't change the data to make them fit your theory. The problem here is that people in restaurants and cafeterias inside this place are not wearing the fucking mask, and this is the problem. No, this is not the problem. This is not the problem, because there's plenty of places where you have restaurants and bars with people with no mask. So again, I can quote Florida, I can quote Sweden, even Italy we didn't have masks, and you don't have a difference in rates between places where everyone is wearing a mask and many people are not. You don't see that. You just don't see that. You can, I'm not showing it here, but there's a lot of plots and graphs you can see of charts that you can see on the, for example, for the US, for those states that had a mask mandate and those who didn't. So you had places with a lot of stringent rules about where to wear masks, how to wear them, and all these kind of things, and others that did have no rule. So how come that they have the same curves? If masks count that much, why is it that after all these months of mask wearing, why is it that, you know, after we have 90% compliance rate in Italy? It's 90%. If 90% of the population is wearing masks, why is this thing still around? It's the same thing in France. In Sweden, they had maybe 10 to 20% of people wearing masks. So why isn't Sweden like 10? They have like 5 times less in percent terms of people wearing masks. So why is it that even if it's, you know, it's 5 times less and still don't have 5 times more dead people? That's the question to ask. Because I mean, I can understand why you would think that masks work, because you would say they stop the droplets, they filter some particles, you get less, maybe they filter the virus, and that's fine, right? So the thing is, if you say that masks what I can say is this: the way we wear masks, the way masks have been, you know, going around, do not really have a significant impact on the way the virus is being spread, because places with no mask mandate or less stringent mask mandates had exactly the same spread. Exactly not, but you know, you had some fluctuations, but you don't see a trend. I mean, again, if you claim that the masks are very I mean, I could make another GattoCast episode just on the mask, because it's something that there's a lot of literature. There's a nice review on that, and the review, which is pro mask, if you take them seriously, it shows that the masks do not work, because they have some plot there that's correlating the effectiveness of the masks with the R of T that you expect, so the reproduction rate. And so they claim that if you have like 80% of compliance, and then you should always have a reproduction rate below 1, which is not the case, which means that masks are not effective. Anyway, so this is something more complicated, and I am in favor of taking precautions, but not in favor of lockdowns. This is a comment. I completely agree. I mean, I think that it makes sense to take precautions. If you think it's important for you, you should be very careful in wearing masks. I'm not saying that masks do not work. I'm saying the kind of mask that people usually wear are not having an effect. Though the only place that enforced FFP2, so it's I think it's N95 in the US, so it's very it's this kind of mask that filter 95% of the particles. It was Germany, and they had a third wave, and the rate of descent of cases after the enforcement of this mandate was the same as everywhere else. You can compare it, for example, with the US. It was very similar, or other, even Italy. Italy, I think it was something different. But again, you cannot really see the effect of enforcing a mandate on very sophisticated masks. It's exactly the same as everywhere else, and still they got the third wave, so they're entering into a third wave. So but again, I think it's something that you want, we should do. It's something that should be left for every one of us. If we want to take precautions, you should. You don't want to go out, great. I'm just saying that, you know, the common wisdom that we know, that if you keep people at home, then the virus does not spread. This is not true. The virus is still going around somehow. So, I mean, still argue that you should lock down even more. I would argue that it doesn't make much sense, because it's just destroying people's lives. And again, like, if you push it to the limit, then you could just argue for killing everyone, so no one dies of COVID. You shoot everyone, and no one dies of COVID, and problem is solved. But we shouldn't really care just about COVID. We should care about other things in life and in society, because again, restrictions have an impact on lives. And I'm not talking about this, but there are considerable costs. So if you do a cost-benefit analysis, you find out that it's not worth it. Anyway, so there's another question. So the quarantine is not necessarily the best method to stop contagion. So what is the purpose of lockdown? The purpose of lockdown is preventing people from meeting, because so the idea is, in epidemiological model, is that you have interaction between people, and so you have people that are infected and people that are not infected. And if you don't prevent people that are infected, people that are not infected, then the virus will spread, and so this spread will be proportional to the number of infected people. And so until you don't reach the until you reach the herd immunity. Okay, so this is the theory, but it's not what's happening in practice. So the purpose of lockdown was preventing people from meeting, because it's thought that, you know, that's the way that the virus spread, but it's still spreading in places which did lock down. And anyway, the places that did lock down did not do so much better than those who didn't. And again, locking down it's not a small thing that you're doing. It's something macroscopic, and you should see a huge effect, and you don't see that. So at best, you have some small effect on reduction of the cases. Okay, so I see the point, but with the virus being airborne, if you restrict the social contacts, it's proved that people doing this are not getting infected. It's not proved. I mean, again, the data that shows that even if you reduce, you reduce mobility, you reduce social contacts, because you prevent, you shut down all the restaurants and bars, you shut down the schools, and this is what's happening in a lockdown, right? So you're closing places where people meet. So you are restricting the social contacts by orders of magnitude. You're meeting hundreds of people less every day, because you're not going to concerts, you're not going to bars, you're not going to restaurants, you're not going to school, university. So it's thousands of people less that you meet every day, hundreds of people less. It depends on where you live. And so this is not shown, because these places have exactly, on average, the same rates as places that didn't close anything. So why is this the case? I don't know. I mean, I understand that if you do a lab experiment, a controlled experiment in a laboratory, you do find that you have, if you wear the masks in some way, then you prevent the virus from, you filter that. There are some studies on this, and I'm not saying they're not valid. What I'm saying is that once you apply all these measures in real life, then we are still missing some elements. So in real life, all these ideas that work really nice, because I understand it, that if I have the virus and I don't meet anyone, then I'm not spreading the virus. Okay, fair enough. What if, it's enough that I open the window and then the virus goes, with the wind or with some particles? I mean, I don't know. Again, I'm making stuff up. Maybe this is the case. Maybe it's not. These are the things that should be studied. But we should start from the data. So the data, clearly says that if you do all these kind of restrictions, you don't reduce anything. So what? So should we trust the data or should we trust the theory? So have you talked about this with any health worker or just with other scientists? No, I know a lot. Actually, I'm trying to get two. I know a pharmacist and a doctor that are completely on the same page as I am, and they have written scientific articles on on masks, on lockdowns, and everything. And there's people who agree. There's a huge problem that I'm not making this stuff up, but there's a lot of censorship. I mean, there's a lot of self-censorship because this is like it's not the dominating point of view at the moment, especially among doctors, and so people are afraid to be really discriminated. They don't want to go out and state these things publicly. But there's I know enough doctors and health workers, biologists that do not agree with lockdowns, and they think pretty much. I mean, they say pretty much the same things that I say, but for they see them from another perspective. But there are, and I hope to bring them in the show. So and again, I'm talking about medical doctors and pharmacists and people, like scientists that work in the field, and they can make a very good point. And again, but none of what I'm saying is based on about that. So let me see if okay, let's think. Another interesting matter is people's mental health during and after the pandemic. Yes, it's an interesting thing. It's something that's been very overlooked, but I can tell you as a I can tell you as a musician that I know enough people whose mental health is not okay, and they're really being suffering this thing because they, like being told your job does not count anything, you're useless, and we can just shut down your activity. Even I mean, this is the same thing for musicians, for technicians, for sound engineers. That's like the whole category has been hit so hard, and they're just being made believe that they don't count anything. It's they're super, they are not necessary, and they can just be put on aside because their job is not essential. And so just we'll just put on aside and let you know maybe in the future if we need you again. And that's very sad, and for many people it's very disappointing. I mean, for me it's very disappointing. I have other jobs, I'm doing other stuff, so I'm fine. I'm doing, like, personally, like, I think this 2020 was a very good year for me on for many things, so I'm not complaining for myself, but I see that people are suffering from this. And again, so I think that's pretty much time to end this GattoCast episode. Thanks a lot again for being with me. Sorry for being so, I don't know, so boring. I'm a different person when I'm with Nanowar still, but this is the way science goes. And thanks a lot, and see you in the future for the next GattoCast live episode.